This is the Cocos Keeling Islands, a scatter of coral atolls in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with fewer than 600 residents. For more than 150 years, this territory was never really governed at all, at least not by any government anyone would recognise. It was privately owned and personally ruled by a single Scottish family who styled themselves the Kings of Cocos and answered to no parliament, no constitution, and almost no outside authority whatsoever. Workers here were paid in a currency that only worked in one store on one island, controlled by one family. And generations passed without a single resident ever casting a vote for anything. So how did an entire island chain end up as one family's private kingdom? And how did it ever become part of Australia at all?
The Cocos Keeling Islands sit almost exactly in the middle of the Indian Ocean, roughly 2,935 kilometres northwest of Perth and about 900 kilometres southwest of Christmas Island, the nearest other piece of Australian territory. To put that distance in perspective, a resident of Home Island is considerably closer to Jakarta than to any Australian state capital, closer to Sri Lanka than to Sydney, and separated from the Australian mainland by open ocean that no bridge, tunnel, or land route will ever cross. The entire group consists of 27 small coral islands split into two separate atolls. North Keeling is a single, tiny, uninhabited island, protected today as Pulu Keeling National Park. South Keeling is a horseshoe-shaped ring of islands wrapped around a shallow turquoise lagoon. And this is where nearly everyone actually lives.
The whole territory covers barely 14 square kilometres of dry land, an area smaller than many single farms on the Australian mainland, and its entire population, just under 600 people, is split between two islands inside that horseshoe. West Island holds around 150 residents, mostly Australian government and airport staff rotating through on postings. Home Island holds close to 450, almost all of them Cocos Malay, descendants of the workers brought here 2 centuries ago to build a coconut empire for someone else. No point on either inhabited island rises much more than a few meters above sea level, a detail that seems minor on a calm day and becomes deeply significant later in this story. Before we go further, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If an entire community could vote on whether to remain independent or join a larger nation, as the people of Cocos actually did in Taste to Dvarsot Vasem Deset Chatere, what would make you choose one over the other? Would you weigh the appeal of full sovereignty against the practical security of belonging to a much larger, wealthier country? Or would something else entirely decide it for you? Drop your answer in the comments and let's keep exploring how this tiny atoll ended up facing exactly that choice. The islands themselves are almost entirely a product of coral, not rock. Like most atolls, Cocos began as a fringing reef around the slopes of an ancient volcanic peak that has since sunk beneath the waves, leaving only a ring of living coral growing steadily upward to stay near the sunlit surface. That sinking process is measured not in years, but in geological time. Tiny coral polyps building upward at a rate of only a few millimeters annually. Just fast enough, over hundreds of thousands of years, to keep pace with a volcanic foundation slowly disappearing into the ocean floor beneath it. Charles Darwin actually stopped here in April 1836 aboard HMS Beagle, spending 12 days observing the reef structure, the lagoon, and the surrounding waters in close detail. His observations of the Cocos Atoll became one of the key pieces of evidence behind his theory of coral reef formation and subsidence, a theory proposing that atolls form as volcanic islands slowly sink, while coral growth keeps pace at the surface, a theory that turned out to be correct and that scientists still cite today.
It is a strange kind of fame for a place this small, being the natural laboratory that helped one of history's most important naturalists work out how atolls are actually built, decades before he would publish the work on evolution that made him famous. North Keeling, the uninhabited northern atoll, functions today as a nearly untouched seabird sanctuary. Pulu Keeling National Park protects one of the largest breeding colonies of red-footed boobies found anywhere in the eastern Indian Ocean, along with green turtles that nest on its beaches, and a lagoon almost completely closed off from the surrounding ocean, creating conditions found almost nowhere else in the region. Because North Keeling has never supported permanent human settlement, researchers treat it as something close to a natural control group, a version of what South Keeling's ecosystem might have looked like without 2 centuries of plantation agriculture reshaping nearly every square meter of usable land.
On South Keeling, the coconut crab, one of the largest land-living arthropods on the planet, still climbs palm trees at night in numbers that surprise most first-time visitors, using powerful claws capable of cracking open a coconut shell that would defeat most hand tools. A reminder that this entire ecosystem evolved in near total isolation from any mainland. Manta rays and reef sharks patrol the outer edges of the lagoon, while inside its calmer waters, juvenile fish of dozens of species use the shallow, current-sheltered environment as a nursery before moving out to the open reef, a cycle that has repeated here largely undisturbed for longer than any human record can confirm. For roughly 200 years after European ships first charted these waters, nobody permanently settled here at all. William Keeling, an English sea captain, sailed past the islands in 1609 and left his name on the map without ever landing. It was not until the 1820s that anyone tried to build a life here, and the first attempt came not from Cluny's Ross, but from a different Englishman entirely, an eccentric adventurer named Alexander Hare, who arrived in 16 Chest with a group of followers that included a number of women he had brought from various parts of Southeast Asia, intending to found a personal settlement built entirely around his own authority. Hare's arrangement collapsed within a few years, undermined partly by economic pressure and partly by his followers gradually defecting to work instead for a rival Englishman, who had arrived shortly afterward, offering wages and land rather than dependency on one man's household. That rival was John Cluny's Ross, a Scottish trader who first landed briefly in December 10 Set of Jamps of Gord, then returned with his family in 10 Set Sedum Gord to settle for good, establishing a coconut plantation that would eventually consume nearly the entire habitable land area of the southern atoll and outlast Hare's competing settlement entirely, since by 10 Set 30 Din, Hare himself had abandoned the islands, leaving Cluny's Ross as the uncontested authority over everyone who remained. What followed over the next century and a half is one of the strangest chapters of private rule anywhere in the British world. Cluny's Ross and his descendants effectively governed the islands as personal property, importing workers from the Malay world, from what is now Indonesia and Malaysia, to labour on the copra plantations, and paying them not in ordinary currency, but in a company-issued token currency, the Cocos rupee, plastic coins stamped with the family's own insignia and redeemable only at the family's own store.
Workers lived under a system that combined plantation labor with something close to feudal obligation, owing loyalty and service to the ruling family in exchange for housing, food, and protection, with almost no independent legal recourse and almost no contact with the outside administrative world. Successive generations of Cluny's Ross rulers styled the arrangement almost like a small monarchy in miniature, complete with a fixed hierarchy of authority, passed down through the family line, informal courts to settle disputes among workers, and a degree of control over daily life that extended even to who could marry whom, and who was permitted to leave the plantation at all. Generations of Cocos Malay families grew up entirely within this private economy, speaking their own dialect, practicing their own faith, and knowing essentially no other form of governance, since almost none of them had ever set foot anywhere else in their lives.
It's worth pausing here on a connection to another island story this channel has already told, because Cocos and Pitcairn arrived at a strikingly similar arrangement from completely different starting points. On Pitcairn, a single surviving mutineer named John Adams found himself the sole adult authority over an entire community after the Bounty Mutiny collapsed into violence, and he built a theocratic system around Bible reading and strict personal morality that shaped the island for generations afterward. On Cocos, the concentration of total authority in one family happened not through catastrophe, but through simple commercial opportunity. A trading captain who recognized that isolation itself could become a form of ownership if nobody else was watching closely enough to object. Both places prove the same uncomfortable point from opposite directions. A community small enough and remote enough can end up entirely subject to the judgment of one person or one family for generations, whether that authority arrives through crisis or through quiet, unchallenged accumulation. The islands briefly became the centre of world attention on November 9, 1914, during the opening months of the First World War. The German light cruiser SMS Emden had spent months raiding Allied shipping across the Indian Ocean, and its captain decided to land a raiding party on Direction Island to destroy the cable station operated there as part of the Eastern Extension Telegraph Company's global network, a chain of undersea cables connecting Britain to its empire that contemporaries called the All Red Line. Telegraph operators managed to send out a distress signal moments before the German landing party cut the cable, and that signal reached the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney, which was escorting a troop convoy nearby. Sydney engaged and destroyed the Emden in a battle fought within sight of the atoll, running the German cruiser aground on North Keeling's reef after a fight lasting barely more than an hour. The first major naval victory in the young Royal Australian Navy's history, and one still commemorated in Australian naval tradition today. For a single afternoon, this remote coconut plantation became strategically important enough to draw in warships from opposite sides of the planet, before returning almost immediately to its usual obscurity. The wreck of the Emden left to slowly break apart on the reef, where it remains partially visible to this day. Administrative control of the islands passed formally to Australia in 2095, transferred from Singapore, where the territory had previously been managed as part of the wider British colonial system. But even after that transfer, the Clunies-Ross family continued running daily life on the ground, much as they always had, since Australia initially showed little interest in disturbing an arrangement that cost the government almost nothing to maintain and required almost no direct administrative involvement from Canberra. That changed through the 1970s as international pressure grew over what increasingly looked like an anachronistic private fiefdom operating inside a modern federal nation, with United Nations observers and Australian officials alike increasingly uncomfortable defending a system where an entire ethnic community remained legally and economically dependent on a single family with no path to citizenship, property ownership, or political representation of their own. In 1077, Australia purchased the plantation and its assets from John Cecil Clunies-Ross for £2.5 million, effectively ending a century and a half of private family rule, though the family retained ownership of their home on Home Island until the government finally purchased that too in 1023, closing out the very last remnant of the arrangement that had defined the islands since the 1820s. The final break came in 1984, when the United Nations supervised a formal act of self-determination, giving the Cocos Malay population a genuine choice for the first time in their history. Voters were presented with three options on the ballot: remaining a dependent territory under existing arrangements, becoming fully independent as a separate nation, or integrating completely with Australia as equal citizens. Clunies Ross himself campaigned actively for continued independence, arguing that the islanders were capable of self-governance without Australian oversight, an argument that carried obvious complications given his own family's long history of unilateral control. The islanders voted overwhelmingly to integrate fully with Australia instead, gaining full citizenship, access to Australian schools and healthcare, and legal protections that had simply never existed under the old system. It remains one of the few times a small, historically dependent community anywhere in the world was given an internationally supervised vote on its own political future and chose integration over independence. A decision many residents still describe as straightforward once you understand what came before it. Since integration meant trading a system built entirely around one family's discretion for one built around enforceable, universal rights. Today, the Cocos Malay language remains the daily language of Home Island, a distinctive dialect blending Malay roots with English loanwords and vocabulary innovations that developed nowhere else on Earth, since this specific community existed in near total isolation from other Malay-speaking populations for most of 2 centuries. Linguists who have studied the dialect note that it preserved certain older Malay forms that have since disappeared from mainstream usage in Indonesia and Malaysia, effectively freezing a snapshot of 19th century Malay speech patterns inside a small Indian Ocean community, while the language continued evolving elsewhere. Islam remains the dominant faith, and Home Island's mosque sits at the literal and social centre of the settlement, its call to prayer marking the rhythm of daily life, the way church bells might elsewhere, with the community observing Friday prayers, Ramadan and Hari Raya celebrations, with a level of communal participation rarely matched in larger, more dispersed Muslim communities on the Australian mainland. Family and community ties run extremely deep here, in part because nearly everyone on Home Island can trace their ancestry back to the same small group of workers the Clunies Ross family originally brought to the plantation, making this one of the most genealogically interconnected communities anywhere in Australia, where distant cousinship functions less like a genealogical curiosity and more like an ordinary, everyday social fact everyone simply takes for granted. An ordinary day on Cocos begins with the short ferry crossing between Home Island and West Island, the only practical link between the territory's 2 population centres across the shallow lagoon. Fishermen head out early, targeting reef fish, tuna, and the occasional coral trout in waters still clean enough that visibility routinely stretches many metres down, using small aluminium boats that replaced the traditional wooden vessels of earlier generations without changing much else about the daily rhythm of the work. On Home Island, small shops open selling basic groceries alongside fresh fish brought straight off the boats, while children make their way to the local school, one of the smallest and most remote in the entire Australian education system, where a single classroom often covers several year levels at once, simply because there are not enough students to justify separate rooms. West Island runs on a different rhythm entirely, built mostly around the airport, the small hospital, and the handful of government offices that administer the territory, staffed largely by Australians who rotate through on postings of a few years, rather than families with generations of history on the atoll. Between the 2 islands, the ferry runs on a fixed schedule that shapes nearly every appointment, delivery, and social visit, since missing the boat can mean waiting hours for the next one. a small daily inconvenience that long-time residents plan around instinctively and newcomers learn to respect quickly. The contrast between the two islands, separated by barely 2 kilometers of lagoon, captures the entire story of Cocos in miniature. One side shaped by 2 centuries of Malay settlement and private rule, the other by little more than 50 years of ordinary Australian administration. Economically, Cocos has had to reinvent itself almost completely since the plantation era ended. Copra production, once the entire reason the islands existed as a functioning economy, has largely disappeared, unable to compete with cheaper coconut oil production elsewhere in the world. Once industrial processing made large-scale plantations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific far more efficient than a small, isolated atoll ever could be. What has replaced it is a modest but growing mix of government employment, fishing, and increasingly tourism, built around exactly the kind of isolation that once made the islands so easy for one family to control. Divers now travel here specifically to explore the wreck of the Emden, still resting on the reef, where HMAS Sydney sank it more than a century ago, alongside some of the least disturbed coral reef systems remaining anywhere in the Indian Ocean. Reef systems that owe their pristine condition in part to the very isolation that once made the islands so difficult to reach for anyone other than plantation workers and their overseers. It is a strange kind of economic transformation, an island whose entire history was defined by extreme isolation, now selling that same isolation back to the world as its most valuable asset. Government administration, running the airport, the schools, the hospital, and the various federal offices required to service any Australian territory now employs a significant share of West Island's population directly, an economic base that would have been unimaginable under the old private plantation system, where government in any recognisable sense barely existed at all. Cocos Malay cuisine reflects centuries of adaptation to whatever the surrounding reef and the limited soil could actually provide. Fish, prepared grilled, curried or dried, forms the backbone of most meals, supplemented by coconut in nearly every form imaginable, since the palm that gave the islands their name and their original economic purpose still shapes the local diet just as thoroughly as it once shaped local labour. Coconut milk simmers into rich curries. Grated coconut flesh flavours rice dishes, and coconut oil, once the plantation's entire reason for existing, still finds its way into everyday cooking, generations after the commercial copra trade collapsed. Rice, largely imported given the island's limited farmland, rounds out most plates, and traditional celebrations still centre on communal cooking, with large shared meals marking religious festivals and important community gatherings on home island, where entire extended families and neighbours contribute dishes to a single communal spread, rather than each household cooking separately. Sambal, a chili-based condiment carried over from broader Malay culinary tradition, appears at nearly every meal, adjusted generation after generation to suit whatever fresh ingredients the reef happens to provide that week. Life here comes with limits that most visitors underestimate before they arrive. The territory's only hospital provides basic care, staffed by a small, rotating team of doctors and nurses, handling everything from routine checkups to emergency stabilisation, and anything more serious requires evacuation by air to Perth, a journey of several hours, even under ideal conditions, and considerably longer if weather grounds flights, which happens often enough that residents learn not to take good weather for granted when a medical emergency strikes. Supplies, fuel, and most consumer goods arrive by ship or by the twice-weekly flight connecting Cocos to the Australian mainland, meaning that a delayed shipment can genuinely disrupt daily life in ways people in larger, better connected places rarely have to think about. from fresh produce running short between deliveries to construction materials sitting on order for weeks before finally arriving. Higher education essentially does not exist locally, meaning any resident who wants to pursue university study must relocate to the mainland, often for years at a stretch. A quiet, ongoing drain on the island's youngest and most mobile residents that community leaders openly worry about, even as they take pride in how many eventually choose to return. Healthcare, education, and employment opportunities remain narrower here than almost anywhere else in Australia, a persistent trade-off for the security and cultural continuity that integration with Australia was specifically meant to guarantee. To understand how the Cocos Malay community works to preserve its culture and its environment at the same time, it helps to spend time with Haji Adam, an imam and respected community elder on Home Island, who also works with the Cocos Islands Marine Park and the local tourism association. Haji Adam has spoken publicly about using carefully managed tourism rather than large-scale development as a way to generate income for the community, while protecting the reef systems and cultural practices that make Cocos worth visiting in the first place. As both a religious leader guiding the community's daily spiritual life and a practical advocate for its economic future, he occupies a position that did not really exist under the old plantation system, where authority flowed from a single family rather than from elected councils, marine park boards, or tourism associations answerable to the wider community. His approach treats visitors not as a threat to traditional life, but as a potential partner in sustaining it, provided that growth stays small enough and slow enough that the island's fragile resources and even more fragile social fabric are not overwhelmed in the process. That means resisting the kind of large resort development that has transformed other small island economies almost overnight, favouring instead small guided tours, modest homestays, and diving operations run by residents themselves rather than outside investors. For a community this size, built on this little land, that balance between welcoming the outside world and protecting what makes Cocos distinct is not an abstract policy question. It is the daily, practical work of people like Haji Adam, negotiated one decision at a time, weighing each new proposal against what the reef, the lagoon, and the community's own traditions can actually absorb without being changed beyond recognition. The most serious long-term threat facing Cocos today has nothing to do with governance at all. Home Island, along with most of the inhabited land across the southern atoll, sits barely a few meters above current sea level, and rising seas driven by global climate change now threaten what is recognized as one of Australia's oldest continuously practicing Muslim communities. Coastal erosion has already begun reshaping parts of the shoreline that residents remember differently from just a few decades ago, with older islanders able to point to specific stretches of beach and reef edge that have visibly retreated within their own lifetimes. Modelling suggests that further sea level rise could make significant portions of the currently habitable land unusable, well within the lifetimes of children being born on Home Island today. A timeline measured not in distant centuries, but in decades that current adults expect to live through themselves. Storm surges, once an occasional inconvenience, now carry water further inland than long-time residents recall from their childhoods. And the same porous coral geology that has always denied the islands any natural fresh water source also means there is no elevated ground to retreat to if the current shoreline becomes unlivable. For a community that spent nearly 2 centuries fighting to gain basic political rights and self-determination, the prospect of losing the physical ground beneath that hard-won autonomy represents a particularly bitter kind of irony, one that has little to do with any government's policy choices and everything to do with forces far beyond the atoll's control. Despite all of this, the people of Cocos, and especially the Cocos Malay community on Home Island, show little sign of wanting to leave. Ask most residents why they stay, and the answer rarely centres on economic opportunity, since larger cities on the Australian mainland could offer considerably more of that, along with better hospitals, more schools, and career paths simply unavailable on an island this small. It centres instead on genealogy and belonging, on the fact that nearly everyone on Home Island can point to a specific ancestor who arrived on this exact spot of land under circumstances nobody chose for themselves, and on the deep satisfaction of having eventually, through decades of patient political effort, turned an inherited condition of private servitude into a freely chosen, self-governed home. Young people who do leave for education or work on the mainland frequently describe an unusually strong pull back toward Home Island, a specific gravity that residents attribute partly to the tightness of a community where, unlike almost anywhere else in Australia, everyone genuinely does know everyone, and where the mosque, the extended family network, and the physical rhythm of tide and ferry schedule together create a sense of place that larger, more anonymous cities simply cannot replicate. The vote in 1984 did not erase the plantation era. It simply gave the people who had lived through its long aftermath the power to decide, for the first time in their community's history, what came next. And most of them, when given that choice, decided that what came next should still be Cocos. As the sun sets over the lagoon separating West Island from Home Island, the mosque's call to prayer drifts across water calm enough to reflect the last orange light of the day, fishing boats return to their moorings, and the rhythm of an island shaped first by coconut palms, then by one family's private ambition, and finally by its own residents' hard-fought self-determination, settles once again into evening quiet. Somewhere beneath the surf on North Keeling's outer reef, the rusted remains of the Emden continue their slow, silent dissolution into the coral that will eventually absorb them completely, much as the volcanic peak beneath the entire atoll disappeared into the ocean floor millions of years before any ship, any family, or any single vote ever mattered to anyone. And on Home Island, where nearly every resident can name the specific ancestor who first arrived on this coral rim as someone else's property, the mosque's evening call carries across water that scientists now warn may not remain dry land for every generation still to come. A quiet reminder that the biggest questions facing this tiny community were never really about who governs it at all, but about whether the ground itself will still be there to govern. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Cocos Keeling Islands. If you enjoy exploring the strangest and most isolated corners of the world with us, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next place we uncover.